Hey there, Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Acts video. All right, the video I'm watching today has been recommended to me multiple times over the 2 years that it has been up on YouTube. And for whatever reason, just never really got around to it. But when I see something consistently recommended to me over and over, I know I shouldn't ignore it. Now, the video is titled, "The Election of George Washington Was Weirder Than You Think." By the way, when I just put up this video, I saw the pinned comment was from YouTube friend of mine, Mr. Beat, and he said, "I'm so happy the algorithm recommended this to me. My video about this election is not nearly this good." And I think that says a lot because Mr. Beat's election videos are among the most popular on the entire platform. All right, the original video link is going to be linked down below. Please support that. Let's get started. By the way, this channel is called Premodernist. I don't think I've covered this channel before, so I do not know their style, background, anything like that. If you think there's some things I need to know, then let me know down below. All right, I want to see how weird this was. Our first presidential election. Now, right away, we know it's could go a lot of different ways just because there's no precedent. We had a new constitution, a new system for, voting, selecting leaders and government and all this stuff. So yeah, there's no precedent for this. Let's see what's going down.
The first U.S. presidential election in 1789.
We do know elections are different today.
Very different from the way Americans do presidential elections
We've changed it a lot.
In 1789, there were no official candidates. There was no campaigning for the office. There were no political parties, no nominating conventions, no primary elections.
That idea of no political parties was actually pretty popular back then. I think, people looked at, what the history of political parties were back in other countries and were like, hey, this can cause problems. Maybe our thing should just be electing candidates based on the issues. But that can also be pretty hard, especially if there's not this culture of campaigns and debates, and back then, it'd be much harder. You'd have to travel all around the colonies and the states, I should say, at this time. So it'll be a lot harder than it is now, but it is interesting.
The entire election season was very short. And the major issue of this election was the Constitution itself, whether the very system that they were using as the basis for the election, whether they would keep the system. Okay, well, you might be thinking, why were they electing a president for the first time in 1789? Didn't they declare independence in 1776?
You guys know a story here. Yeah, I mean, the war is not going to end until the early 1780s. But then we had the Articles of Confederation. We ran without a constitution and wanted to just be more like, hey, a bunch of states that kind of work together. That's what a confederation is. So, and then the fact that the Constitution will also take a long time to get ratified. But he's going to go into it.
What were they doing for those 13 years? Well, they didn't have a president during those 13 years.
Right.
It's important to remember that the United States of America was not originally a single country.
Right.
It was a collection of 13 separate countries. The 13 colonies that were participating in the rebellion had each been separate from each other, distinct colonies.
Right.
With ties between themselves and Britain, but not really ties amongst themselves between the different colonies.
Yeah, I mean, it depends too, because each had their own kind of representatives. They had their own, different delegations and stuff like that. That's why the Continental Congresses were a big deal, because actually having a meeting of representatives of people selected from these different parts of, the country, if you want to call it that, that was a big deal and unprecedented.
So when the 13 colonies declared their independence, they did so not as a single unified country, but as 13 separate countries in association with each other, what we would today call an international organization, in order to accomplish their common goal of freeing themselves from British rule. There was only one branch of government, effectively, on the federal level, which was the Continental Congress.
Right.
Although to call it the federal level is a stretch, because there wasn't a federal government, so to speak.
So there wasn't a permanent body there of professional delegates like we have today. It's just like, hey, if we have to meet, somebody calls it and then we send some representatives, you know what I mean?
Anything that the Continental Congress decided to do had to be enforced by the states. And if a state did not want to enforce it, they didn't have to.
Right.
Some people at the time saw this as a problem. And they thought that the states would be better off if they entered into a closer union with each other.
Yeah.
This was mainly for financial reasons, but I'm not going to get into that.
Well, a couple of them would be something like a universal, weights and measures, like print money that everybody can use. Interstate trade deals. Those were a couple of the big ones.
So they held a constitutional convention in Philadelphia in 1787. in which they drafted the Constitution that we use today in the United States.
Right.
Now, this new Constitution was different from the way it had been before. So under the old system,
The Articles of
you had one
Confederation
branch of government, the
referring to-
Continental Congress. In this new system, there were three branches of government. There was the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch.
And under the Articles, we wouldn't have had an executive or judicial branch.
The legislative branch would consist of Congress, but now Congress would have two separate houses.
Right.
A House of Representatives, which would represent the people directly, and the Senate,
And
which
based on
would represent the states.
amount of people.
And then
Senate
the
being
executive
equal
branch
power
would be
among
headed
states.
by a president. And then under him would be everyone who is in charge of executing the laws passed by Congress.
By that term, president, we use it today to often think about political leaders, but in those days, from what I understand, they chose that title because it usually represented more of an economic leader rather than something political. And maybe that was to try to differ away from the idea that this would be like, something like a king. So it was like a softer term for somebody in power.
And then the judicial branch was headed by the Supreme Court, and then there would be various courts underneath the Supreme Court.
Right.
So one of the questions that the framers of the Constitution had to answer was, how are they going to get the president chosen?
Right.
Now, one obvious choice would be to have him chosen by Congress. That would essentially make it a parliamentary system. Like
Right.
in most English-speaking countries, there's a parliamentary system where Parliament decides who the prime minister is going to be, and the prime minister runs the government.
Specifically the
The
lower
framers of the
house
Constitution
said
did
there.
not want to do that. And by framers, I mean the men who met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 and drafted the Constitution. They're called framers, the framers.
This is where we're going to get some interesting things with, eventually an electoral college rather than, the Senate or House of Representatives electing, and also not from a popular vote from citizens. Get this weird kind of mishmash, right?
They didn't want to do that. They wanted to maintain a strict separation between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So that was off the table. So how else could they elect the president? Well, one option, which is the option I think most Americans today would take for granted, was that the president would be elected directly by the voters. The framers of the Constitution also didn't like that idea.
Direct popular vote.
They thought that would be not practical to do that, and also not wise. So the framers...
We'll understand, too, that not all people could necessarily vote. We had still things about like land ownership, and it was still a smaller amount of people. But then I guess it would become more like an aristocracy.
hit upon another system that was neither of those two things. What they would have would be the famous electoral college, this body of individuals who exist within the executive branch, so you don't have to worry about cross-contamination with the legislative branch. And the electoral college's only job was every 4 years they would elect the president. Now, how do you choose the members of the electoral college? Well, they just left that up to the states.
Yep.
However the states wanted to do that. If
This is where it gets interesting, because like this electoral college, we don't really think of it as like a body of people. I mean, nobody can name one, or you don't know how they're chosen or who they are. And that's where it's kind of like, it's not what it was originally too. It's this like body of people. Now people just think of, okay, a state gets this many votes. And if you have the highest percentage of votes for a candidate for a certain state, they get all those votes, with a couple of the other little, caveats where some of the states can split electoral votes, but you get all those votes. It's so interesting where it's perceived today as it was back then.
the state legislature wanted to choose their electors, they could do that. If the state legislature wanted to leave that up to the voters to decide,
But also
they
will
could do
be
that too.
determined later with other.
So the American presidential election has
measures.
2 stages. First, you have to choose the electors. And then once the electors are chosen, they choose the president. That's still the system that's used in the U.S. today. And when Americans go to the polls in early November of an election year, they're voting for electors.
So it looks like the same. It's interesting that you might think, okay, well, why not again just use popular vote, scrap that. But like the idea of just using those in the legislature, it's like they want a different body of people that are going to be lawmakers versus people that choose the president. I kind of get that, I guess, in a way, because it does separate those bodies a lot more. That the legislature again is not the thing. Like it's just the executive branch is just an extension of that. You can kind of see the idea, I guess, they're going for there.
Americans go to the polls in early November of an election year, they're voting for electors. And then the electors meet, nowadays it's in the middle of December, and they cast their votes for president, and that's the actual election of the president. So what we call election day is actually
Nobody
the election
thinks
of the
about the
electors.
December thing.
The Constitution gives Congress the power to decide when each of those elections happens, when the electors are elected and when the president is elected. Nowadays, it's early November and mid-December. In this first election in 1789...
By the way, in the election coverage I was just doing, I asked a few questions about potential changes. And of course, the electoral college thing is always a big thing for debate, but brought in the question about, what do you think about the day that we do voting on? Right, where you got this like first Tuesday of November, because some people are saying, should it be like on a weekend, for example? Should it be a federal holiday to make sure that people have potentially more time in their day to actually go to a voting place? We know that certain places around the country, you may have to wait a long time for a vote, especially if you want to do it in person, and rather than early voting or mail-in voting. But what do you think about the date we do on that? Because again, a lot of countries, if you're outside of the United States, they'll do it like on a weekend. And a lot of them are like, I've talked to, are like perplexed why Americans do it on a weekday.
The election of electors happened on January 7th, and then the electors would meet and choose the president on February 4th, 1789. So election day in 1789 was January 7th. That was what we would call election day. Now,
Right.
some online sources will say that this particular presidential election happened over 2 years.
But the election being the electors, not citizens. That happens before.
88, 89. It's not quite true. The election was January 7th, 1789. It was just in 1789.
Right.
Where that's kind of true is in 2 states, in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. They actually had a 2-stage process for choosing their electors. They would have voters essentially nominate who they would want to have as electors, and then the state legislature would choose from a list that the voters sent up to the legislature. So in both New Hampshire and Massachusetts, the voters went to the polls. Polls isn't the right word. The voters went to their town meetings and voted for who they'd like to be elector. And then those names went to the state legislature. And on January 7th, the state legislature picked from among that list. But in the other states that participated in the election, it was just January 7th, 1789.
Right. Okay.
Now, there were 11 states that participated in the election of 1789. Rhode Island and North Carolina had rejected the Constitution and therefore were technically not part of the United States and not participating in the election.
They're going to ratify it eventually, but yeah. Isn't that interesting? It's states that didn't do it because they didn't have to. They didn't participate. They didn't ratify it. So it will happen after this election, which is so interesting time-wise. By the way, if you know, after the American Revolution, as part of the treaty, the border went up to like the Mississippi, So that's why you see North Carolina look kind of weird back then.
In 5 of the states, the state legislatures chose the electors. In 4 of the states, the electors were chosen directly by the voters. And then in 2 other states, they had a hybrid system.
It's going to be hard to keep track
Now,
of.
let's take a minute and look at the states that did direct elections, because they did it differently in the different states. In Pennsylvania and Delaware, they had statewide elections, meaning in Pennsylvania, wherever you were in the state, if you were voting in the election, you voted for 10 names. And then the top 10 vote getters statewide would become elector. Delaware did the same thing, but they had 3 electors. So wherever you were statewide, you voted for 3 names. In Maryland, it was also statewide. Everybody wrote down 8 names because Maryland got 8 electors.
Right.
But Maryland had a rule where 5 of the names had to come from the Western Shore and 3 of the names from the Eastern Shore.
Okay.
Virginia did it a little bit differently because
trying to separate a little bit, maybe the political differences, or urban versus rural areas. I could see why. I guess you would do that. All right, Virginia
legislature actually created electoral districts. Virginia got 12 electoral votes. And so the legislature divided the state up into 12 electoral districts. Each one would elect 1 elector.
Were we getting some early instances of gerrymandering?
And these were distinct from the 10 congressional districts that Virginia had. Virginia was the only state to do it this way. So looking at the different states and the way they did it, that reflects the politics of the different states. So Pennsylvania, for example, the Pennsylvania legislature was dominated by federalists, meaning people who were pro-Constitution.
Right.
Support for the Constitution tended to be stronger in the cities.
And in essence, more like universal sort of collectivity that way. I want to say, I mean, like more federal power, more national government power. But yeah, it is.
So
that's why like Rhode Island, by the way, was like not involved in the stuff. They did not want things closer and closer to having like Rhode Island being controlled or influenced by other big states or entities outside of Rhode Island. That's why they held on so long. And there's a lot of things I think people will especially thank Rhode Island for, and holding out, for example, was the Bill of Rights. That's why the Bill of Rights comes out and it gets tacked onto the Constitution, because it wasn't part of it originally, was a lot of fears, again, like a small state having bigger fears of potential rights or something being taken away, getting that tacked on. So I think a lot of people can appreciate little guys like Rhode Island holding out the way they did.
They thought by making it a statewide ballot, it would make it more likely for Federalists to be elected as elector. The Virginia legislature was dominated by Anti-federalists, people who were opposed to the new Constitution.
What do you guys think of this system? Let me know.
And they wanted to improve the rural vote. And so they drew districts to make it more likely that rural people would be elected as electors, and rural people were more likely to be opposed to the Constitution.
Right, it's true.
And this touches...
Yeah, federalism and a lot of those ideas, more populous areas, you saw it there. Those areas are a lot more affected by, interstate, a lot of the interstate commerce and interaction with others. So they probably feel that there's entities that need to connect that, where the rural way of life is more individualistic and not as connected to these other people and to other population densities. All right, the major issue of the election. Okay, what is it?
It's on the big issue of the presidential election that year, which was the Constitution itself, whether the Constitution was even a good idea. It was extremely controversial in a way that I think most Americans today probably don't really realize.
It drives me nuts when people talk and try to have this fantasy that these founding fathers, as they often get called about, were just unified in this idea of what it needs to be. We're all like individually inspired in the same way with the same goal, with the same ideas, when it was the exact opposite. I do not really like that idea that a lot of people have about what they think the Constitution is, almost like a inspired thing that way, whereas everybody just like puppets of, I don't know, God, whatever it is you want to espouse it to.
There were a lot of people who were opposed to the Constitution at the time.
It was heavily divided.
And passage of the Constitution was quite controversial in several states.
Small ones.
Some Americans felt like the Constitution was a betrayal of the goals of the Revolutionary War. They felt like they had traded one tyranny for another. They'd gotten rid of the tyranny of the British Parliament and the British monarchy, and they had now were instituting a new tyranny.
I've never seen this picture before. This is wild. You see him made up of, like the king made up of all these little individuals looking at him. This is awesome.
Tyranny of a new federal monarchy, and they had now were instituting a new tyranny of a new federal system. A lot of Americans, especially in rural areas and out in the western areas, were afraid that this new federal system...
So interesting to think of Manhattan again as these farming communities. I mean, look at that map there. Big farms. Now it's, the most densely populated place, this island, especially in the whole country.
Would be opposed to their own interests, that the federal government would be dominated by commercial interests from the port cities, and would make policy decisions that would financially benefit the big port cities and disadvantage rural areas.
Philly,
in fact,
Boston,
this controversy between those who favor the Constitution and those who are opposed to it ended up making it so that New York could not participate in the presidential election at all, because the New York legislature was divided. The upper house, the Senate, was majority Federalist. The lower house, the Assembly, was majority Anti-federalist.
I mean, we see this all the time. Happens all the time in politics, right?
So the Senate, which was 10-8 in favor of the Constitution, wanted each house of the legislature to choose 4 of New York's 8 electors. The Senate would choose 4, and the Assembly would choose 4. And that way, 4 of New York's 8 electors would be pro-Constitution. The Anti-federalists wanted the legislature to decide on the electors as a whole. So each member of the legislature would get 1 vote. They would have 1 slate of 8.
So they're hoping, with that they can get more anti-federalist representation. But again, there's a reason why you have 2 separate bodies there.
Essentially, they would choose them in a joint session of the two houses. What that would mean practically is that all 8 of New York's electors would be anti-constitution.
Right.
So the Assembly would pass a bill saying this is how we're going to choose our electors. It would go to the Senate. The Senate would say, no, we're not going to do it that way. They would pass their own bill that would go back to the Assembly, and the Assembly would turn it down. It went to conference committee. They argued over it, couldn't come to a resolution. This went on for weeks.
It shows you that even with some of our first elections, people aren't as supportive of like the systems of how we choose things, but more about what is going to help their own personal goals politically and the people that they want represented. So rather than the systems, it's like, hey, whatever, we just want to do whatever it takes to make our person or our ideas become the official ones.
Then January 7th came and they were deadlocked. So midnight, January 7th, they still hadn't chosen their electors. That was it.
Their homework's due.
So they did not have electors. The same gridlock meant that New York had no senators because it was up to the state legislature to choose senators. So it took them until, I think, the summer of 1789 to finally decide who their senators were going to be.
That's late. Yeah.
A similar thing actually happened in New Hampshire because New Hampshire's legislature was also divided in a similar way. But in that case, the Anti-federalists in the lower house of the New Hampshire legislature gave in and agreed to the Senate's terms. So New Hampshire did, and it was very close to midnight.
This really is wild and complicated.
So New Hampshire did end up participating in the election. Now, this business of whether an elector was pro-Constitution or anti-Constitution, what was that about? The Constitution ended up getting approved in these 11 states, but there were a lot of people who were uncomfortable with it. And so what they hoped they could do
state power
was get a second
power.
convention. That's what they wanted to have. They wanted to get a second constitutional convention that would draft a different constitution that would be more acceptable to the Anti-federalists.
Yeah.
Barring that, they could, at the very least, get elected to positions within the federal government.
If you don't know the Federalist, Anti-federalist kind of debate, probably go look for something else, something a little bit more detail, because it seems like you do need to kind of understand that concept to kind of understand what's going on here. We don't have the time or anything to really go in that because it's a lot more detailed, but I would definitely recommend looking up. I know there's a ton of good content about that.
And then undermine the federal system from within, and thereby prevent the full weight of the federal government from coming into force, perhaps make people disillusioned with the federal system and provoke them to agree to a new constitutional convention. Another thing was if you get anti-federalists elected to Congress, at the very least, they could be clamoring to get amendments.
Yeah. Now, I guess if we had to summarize a little bit between the arguments for in relationship to what's going on here with like elections and things, is kind of the debate between where should the majority of power lie in the United States? Should it be with the states or should it be with a federal government, a national government that, goes over everybody, and finding that balance? And what the Constitution ends up being, remember, is a compromise of that. Not everybody's going to get what they want, but they at least agree to something they think could be functional.
Now, when the Constitution was approved in the various states, the pro-Constitution people promised, which seems a little bit shady in retrospect, honestly, but they said in the various states, the pro-Constitution people promised, which seems a little bit shady in retrospect, honestly, but they said, oh, go ahead and approve the Constitution now. We promise we'll adopt amendments later.
Yeah.
So people were voting for the Constitution.
It's true.
With the promise in the future, it wasn't really binding.
Well, and most states were like, fine. The ones that did have apprehension about it. But again, like a Rhode Island was like, nope, absolutely not. So they're the ones who didn't take the bait.
But with this understanding that in the future amendments will be adopted, which ended up happening. That was the Bill of Rights.
And specifically, it was about rights to protect you from the government. Because that was one of the big things about Anti-federalists was that fear that, again, federal government would be too big. So actually put it in there about protections from the government. Because Federalists were like, let's just get this through and we can, deal with that stuff later. But yeah, like a Rhode Island's like, no, we're not getting anything in there till we get those kind of rights. Again, protections.
Came into effect in 1791. But that was the idea of electing anti-constitution electors. They were hoping that if you get enough anti-federalists as electors, then they could cause problems for the presidential election. Everybody knew that Washington was going to become president. They knew that actually back in 1787 when they were drafting the Constitution. George Washington was one of the Virginia's delegates, and he was actually sitting there in the room while they're all talking about the president. And it was kind of an open secret that they're creating this office, and George Washington's going to be the guy they're going to put in that office.
I feel like Franklin could have been great, you know, for that, like 15 years before that, potentially. But he was so old, and then, I mean, Franklin was the most popular American of the colonial era, but yeah, they barely got him up there to be able to be a part of this. They had to pretty much lift him up because he was decrepit at that time. He lived a full life, man. He partied hard and did a lot of things for the growth and the independence of the United States. You can see him there chilling with his cane, looking right back at the camera there.
First.
So
the Federalists were afraid that anti-federalist electors might mess up the election. And how would they do that? The framers of the Constitution created this system where the electors would vote for two people for president rather than one person. And then the person who got the most votes would become president, and the person who got the second most votes would be vice president.
That's such a wild thing to think about now that we had that at the beginning of the country. It seems like, you know, your vice president and your president should be somebody, you know, unified, I guess, in that way. That's kind of how we look at it today. But back then, it was like it kind of balanced it out a little bit. It kind of balanced out the powers, or it's like, yeah, you got the runner up, then you got the person, you know, that wins. And maybe that can, again, balance it out. But it didn't really work that way. And, you know, we got rid of it not very long after this.
And presidents the weakness of this system became apparent immediately. Partner. Because the way it's supposed to work is George Washington will get the most votes, and then John Adams will get the second most votes. Then you get president, vice president. Great. But what if George Washington does not get the most votes? What if he gets the second most votes? What if some anti-federalist electors decide not to vote for George Washington? Maybe they vote for Adams and then some other candidate, just some throwaway name. They could potentially throw the election to Adams, making John Adams the first president and George Washington.
It's kind of like it's the birth already of why our country is going to largely adopt a two-party system. And the idea that third candidates, it almost seems like originally people were conceptualizing as it being a waste, and you're gonna lose. And, you know, rather than having your runner-up or your second best choice, you're not going to have that either.
Washington the vice president. Throw the election to Adams, making John Adams the first president and George Washington the vice president. Now, the problem with that is Adams was not as popular as Washington,
right,
especially in the South. And so that could reduce the goodwill that the general public had for the federal government, right? And so that would help to undermine the federal government and therefore achieve the ends that the anti-Constitution people had.
Yeah. So it's like, especially in this election, if you were the anti-federalist, you didn't like the candidates, the major candidates anyway. So like going for like a John Adams wasn't like good. You didn't like either of those candidates.
That was something that the Federalists were afraid could happen.
Yeah.
Or alternatively, another possibility would be if there were enough anti-federalist electors, they could get George Washington elected president and then an anti-federalist elected vice president. Now, among the anti-federalists, there were a few names, but I think the most common name that was bandied about at the time was George Clinton. If you were an anti-federalist elector, it was expected that you would end up voting for Clinton, maybe Washington Clinton or maybe Adams Clinton. You know, you could do that.
Right.
So just to give you an example of a possible thing that could play out, the Federalist electors could vote for Washington and Adams, and then the anti-federalist electors could vote for Adams and Clinton. And so then Adams ends up getting the most votes. Washington comes in second, Clinton comes in third.
But then you have no anti-federalist, like anti-federalist candidate.
Makes Adams the president, Washington the vice president. Just as one example of many possible permutations of this. So the point is, the system that was written into the Constitution was a bad system. Having the electors vote for two names and not designate which one they wanted to be president, which one they wanted to be vice president was a flaw. And people at the time recognized that as a flaw.
That's interesting, because what if they did separate it though? Like you actually did indicate, okay, I want this guy for vice president. I want this guy for president. What would you get? I mean, still people would probably vote for the two candidates they believe most represent their beliefs, two federalists, maybe two anti-federalists. I don't know how many people though would be like, all right, I do want a federalist, but I also want an anti-federalist. I can't imagine that was popular.
So remember, there are two stages of electing the president. First, you get the electors, and then the electors choose the president. So the electors were going to meet and choose the president on February 4th. In the run-up to that electoral college vote, some political figures in the country were trying to organize a system where they would make sure that Adams didn't get as many votes as Washington. And the most prominent figure in this movement was Alexander Hamilton. He was writing a ton of letters to different people. He was not the only one involved with this. There were a few others also who were writing letters to different states, writing to the different electors, saying, make sure you don't vote Washington Adams. Make sure there are some guys, there who are going to vote for somebody besides Adams. So if you look at the results of the 1789 election, you look at the Electoral College votes, it looks like, everybody voted for Washington, and then a bunch of people voted for Adams. And
isn't it so weird thinking about that? Like it could not have been Washington, and just it's become such a big part of the lore and like mythology of the United States, of George Washington. Like remember, or like think of what if George Washington wasn't? It probably would have been Adams, and he's going to later become president anyways. But just one of these other guys, President Hancock. That's what we did, right? Great signature.
And then there were a bunch of small vote totals for other people. A lot of those votes were deliberate throwaway votes where they would have voted for Adams, but deliberately chose not to vote for Adams because they were trying to mitigate against a potential anti-federalist scheme. In Connecticut, they had 7 electors. 5 of them voted for Washington and Adams. 2 of them voted for Washington and Huntington. The votes for Huntington were going to go to Adams. They voted for Huntington as part of the scheme that Hamilton was organizing. In Pennsylvania, again, those 2 that voted for Hancock would have voted for Adams. In Maryland, there were 8 electoral votes. 2 of the electors could not actually make it to the election. The Electoral College meets on a state-by-state basis. So the electors...
They slept in. By the way, I was going to ask you, what do you guys think about the first election results? Is anything surprising to you guys about how these votes went down? I mean, look at a place like Virginia, which had a pretty wide, decently wide dispersion of votes. Massachusetts was torn. I mean, that makes sense with Adams' background. New Hampshire split, Connecticut split. New Jersey, interestingly, you're going back to the rivalry. They don't like the Bostonians up there, so only get one there, and rather go with John Jay, because there are regional sort of loyalties and regional comfortability with certain candidates. I totally understand that. Pennsylvania, pretty divided there, and that's going to make sense because you have the rural, more federalist areas, and you got the urban ones, and then you've got the more anti-federalist rural areas, there as well. Okay, you see, like Adams doesn't get any in Delaware.
Not actually make it to the election. The Electoral College meets on a state-by-state basis. So
you almost notice, though, the further south you get, the less likely you also had for Adams. So if you're going like Maryland, South Carolina, Georgia, and again, because Adams is seen, as this northern elite federalist that way,
could not actually make it to the election. The Electoral College meets on a state-by-state basis. So the electors in each state come together. In Maryland, the 8 electors were supposed to meet in Annapolis to do their voting. 2 of the electors couldn't make it. One of them was sick. He had gout and therefore couldn't travel. The other one was unable to because of ice that blocked. I think he had to cross either the Chesapeake Bay or a river, and it was filled with ice, and so he wasn't able to make it to Annapolis. Only 6 electors in Maryland participated.
Tweet his vote?
All 6 of them voted Washington and Harrison. Harrison was Chief Justice of the Maryland General Court. He was not a national figure. They voted for him purely as part of Hamilton's scheme.
Yeah, because I'm not going to lie, the candidates in the red there, I do not know much about.
To make sure that Washington came in first and Adams came in second. They would have voted for
black
Adams
handwriting,
otherwise.
yeah.
Now, not all of these votes were like that. In some of the states, the electors really were voting for someone besides Adams because they didn't want Adams. They wanted somebody else instead. I think the votes for John Jay were like that. I think the votes for John Jay were legitimately for John Jay. I mean, I did a lot of reading about this,
They
but I
weren't
couldn't
strategic
figure out
votes
exactly for
that
every
way.
single state what the motivations were of the electors.
Fake votes.
But if I were to guess, and this is based on incomplete research of the election, I think the election would have looked more like this if there hadn't been so much strategic voting. Now, this setup of the way...
I right now teach world history classes, AP and regular. In the first about half of my career, so I was doing world history as well as U.S. history. However, where I teach in high school, when you teach U.S. history, the one I was teaching is a focus on Civil War and to the present. So I never got to go into the really interesting details as a teacher, taking the U.S. history classes in college and stuff like that. And again, I'm also focused on broader world kind of topics, but you do take a bare minimum of U.S. history classes. But I never taught this election before, okay, in like a high school setting where I need to research more and you'll learn so much by teaching. I mean, that's how it works. And so this is great. This is so interesting to me.
The electors would vote for president, voting for two names and not distinguishing which one you wanted to be president and which one vice president. This continued to be a problem in every presidential election after this until they fixed it.
Oh, by the way, if you're wondering why, like it was, I taught Civil War to the present. That's because there's 2 years of where I am of U.S. history, and 1 year is American history up to the Civil War, and then it was Civil War to the present. And in the high school where I'm at, that was it. It was the last half of U.S. history, and the first half of U.S. history was actually in the junior high. I was in the 8th grade, and I never wanted to teach in junior high, so never really even had the opportunity to teach that first half of American history.
And they finally fixed it in the 12th Amendment, where they said that electors will say which one they're voting for president and which one they're voting for vice president.
But then that even changes.
The election results really hurt John Adams.
It changes
I
again.
mean, he didn't have any expectation of being elected president. He, like everyone else, expected Washington to get the most electoral votes, but he didn't expect to get as few electoral votes as he got. And he felt kind of devastated by that.
Oh, he was sad.
It's kind of sad because it didn't have to happen that way. They didn't have to worry that
it was strategic.
The Anti-Federalists would pull off a scheme, because they didn't. All the fears about Anti-Federalist shenanigans
They didn't
came
want him
to
in
nothing.
there too.
Washington easily got all 69 electoral votes, and Adams wasn't going to get more than him. Like there were enough people voting for Hancock and John Jay and Rutledge.
It makes sense now a little bit. Yeah, with Adams, he was largely a victim of the system. But again, even though he's going to be vice president, that's a big deal, but it just, I guess, hurts his ego. But yeah, you can see it because of the plot of Anti-Federalists
to prevent Adams from
he wanted the pity vote
with Washington. So it's kind of sad how that worked out.
He'll get to be president.
Those are the election results. George Washington,
who won,
was elected president. John Adams was elected vice president. They both traveled to New York, which was the first seat capital of the federal government, and were sworn in the spring of 1789.
People kind of, I feel like, forget that too. They, know about Philadelphia kind of being, big deal in the colonial era, and then Washington. But yeah, the little New York period.
To begin their first terms, respectively. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this election. If you're an American, do you think it'd be better or worse to have our elections the way they were back in 1789?
Good question.
If you're not an American, how much better do you think your system is compared
You probably think this is ridiculous.
The original American system?
He says, if you're not an American, how did you make it to the end of this video? If you are not American, I really, really want to hear from you in the comments what you think about all this. And tell me what you think about your system.
Of 1789. I do plan on doing a follow-up video on the next presidential election, 1792, when George Washington was reelected. So stick around for that.
Remember, too, they didn't have term limits then. So Washington could have kept going, but, the famous thing is he didn't. And that became a really important precedent that, it's not just going to be expected that a president is just going to keep running until they either get defeated or die. A lot of people appreciate that, and I think most people do.
Thanks for watching.
Cool. You can go through his video and see all the footnotes. I was noticing that in the bottom left corner. He had numbers for the end notes there, so really cool to check out. All right, my final thoughts. All right, well, this was super informative. Again, my studies in college and as a teacher did not focus on this part of American history. So getting to this level of detail was very interesting. And I think even still, though, if I did teach this lesson to my students, it's a lot more complicated than I think I could even do, and it'd probably just go over their heads. But I do think some of the key elements that are interesting to talk about is, how the election process has changed, and just the fact that it has changed over time, from how vice presidents were chosen and what the electoral college is like, and how that's very much changed, today. Things like term limits, and then the whole debate, about with the Federalists and Anti-federalists about federal power versus state power. I think those are the things that I tend to be able to communicate in the classes that I teach. But this was really interesting. And if I did go back to teaching U.S. history again, and then got into this time period, it would be fun to go into this a little bit more with the students. So anyway, what do you guys think of kind of how this went down right at the birth of this country? And again, what do you think of the system, how it's changed? Do you think we're in a better position now? Do you like this older system? I don't know. A lot of things I think you could talk about. So let's see them down in the comments. All right, we'll see y'all next time.